Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I did not plan on surviving the end of the world from a ski patrol cabin buried in snow. My name is Daniel Carter. Before the outbreak, I was a senior ski patroller and EMT at Arapahoe Basin ski area in Colorado. I am 34 years old, trained in avalanche rescue, outdoor emergency care, and lift evacuation. I knew how to splint broken legs on steep terrain, how to dig someone out of a snowslide before they suffocated, and how to run a rope line in whiteout conditions. None of that was supposed to prepare me to live alone at over 11,000 feet through a winter full of the infected. The first real sign that something was wrong came on a Saturday in late January. It was around 9:15 a.m., and I was at the top of the Lenawee lift, standing outside the small patrol cabin there. The sky was clear, the wind light, and the temperature was around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Classic high-altitude winter morning. I was checking our avalanche beacons and doing a quick scan down the front side of the mountain with binoculars, just watching guests cruise the groomers. Our patrol radios usually stayed busy. Calls about minor falls, lost kids, someone feeling altitude sickness, and occasionally something worse. That morning, though, the chatter on the national news channels inside the patrol room was stranger than usual. Between runs, I had heard mention of a fast-spreading neurological infection in several major cities. At first, it sounded like one of those health segments they push too hard, something serious but not immediate to us. By 10:30 a.m., it sounded different. The anchor's tone was flat, rehearsed but stressed. Words like violent behavior, quarantines, and lockdowns kept repeating. During a quick stop inside, I saw footage that did not look staged. People attacking each other in the street with no sense of self-preservation. Security forces in full protective gear trying to contain crowds that moved in a way I can only describe as completely disconnected from fear. I turned down the volume and stepped outside again. The Front Range peaks stretched out around me, calm and cold. Down at the base area, I could see parking lots filling like any other busy weekend. People unloading skis, kids running in colorful jackets, someone grilling by an RV. If you did not know what was happening elsewhere, you would think it was just a good day on the mountain. Around noon, Patrol got a message from management over our internal channel. The resort director's voice came over the radio, steady but tighter than usual. Patrol, this is base. We're closing early due to a state emergency directive. Begin coordinating guest sweep no later than 1:30 p.m. Repeat, all lifts will close early today. Details to follow. We all exchanged looks, even though we were spread across the mountain. The lead patroller on shift acknowledged the order and began assigning sweeps. Early closures happened for high winds or incoming storms, but the sky was clear and radar had shown nothing. The only storm we had was on the screen in the patrol room. By 1:30 p.m., we were clearing trails, moving people downhill, answering the same questions over and over. Why are you closing? The weather's perfect. Is there a problem with the lifts? Is this about that virus on the news? We had no real answers, just a fixed line. State directive, folks. We need everyone to head to the base area. You'll get more information there. The plan, at least from what management told us, was for the guests to be loaded back into their cars and directed down Highway 6 in an orderly fashion, with state troopers and local deputies managing outbound traffic. That might have worked, if the infection had stayed where it started. It did not. The last chair I helped unload that day came up just after 2 p.m. A family of 4, kids maybe 10 and 12, all smiles and red cheeks, sliding off like nothing was wrong. As soon as they cleared, the lift operator hit the stop button. Chairs swung gently in the air, empty seats dangling over long strips of snow. It felt wrong to see a lift stop so early on a day with good weather. I skied down to the patrol cabin, clipped off my skis, and stepped inside. The radio on the wall near the first aid shelf crackled with overlapping transmissions. One channel carried our patrol net, but another was pulling in state emergency broadcasts. I heard the words I-70, Silverthorne, and Incident at Gas Station, all in one breath. Another patroller, Mark Salazar, was inside, still in his patrol jacket, helmet resting on the table. He looked up at me, jaw clenched. "Dan, you might want to hear this," he said, nodding toward the radio. I stepped closer. The emergency channel was talking about a multi-vehicle collision near a gas station off the interstate. They mentioned aggressive individuals attacking others on the roadway. The description was almost word for word what I had heard from the national news, but this time it was just a few miles away, down in the valley. The resort director broke in on our patrol frequency. "All patrollers, listen up. We're suspending regular operations and shifting to emergency mode. The state is advising people to shelter in place where they are and to limit travel. Guests who have already left will be on the highway before this guidance. For anyone still on property, begin directing them to stay in the lodge until we receive further instructions." "Shelter in place? In the lodge?" I asked, more to myself than anyone else. Mark shook his head. "We're going to have hundreds of people in that building if this keeps up." We followed orders. For the next hour, we tried to redirect people away from their cars and back toward the main lodge. Most did not want to hear it. Some followed instructions, others ignored us entirely and headed for the parking lot. We did not have any legal power to hold them, just radios, jackets, and calm voices. It started to fall apart around 3:15 p.m. One of the lower mountain patrollers called in, panicked, but trying to sound professional. He reported that some guests coming from the parking area were injured. Bites, strange deep wounds, frantic behavior. He said one man had attacked another in front of the loop where the shuttle buses turned around. The injured man kept moving in a way that did not match muscle or nerve damage. The radio transmission cut off briefly in the middle of his description, then came back with the sound of yelling in the background. "Base, this is Patrol 3. We have multiple aggressive individuals at base. They're not responding to verbal commands. We need security at the lodge entrance now. Some of them they're not stopping when we try to restrain them." I grabbed my pack, already loaded with basic trauma supplies and an avalanche beacon, and looked at Mark. "I'm heading down," I said. He nodded. "I'll stay up here, keep the top covered. If they need a sweep crew, I'll coordinate." I pushed my boots into the bindings, tightened the straps on my helmet, and launched down the run. The snow was firm but forgiving, and I let gravity do most of the work, carving down groomed trails that had emptied faster than I had ever seen. By the time I reached mid-mountain, it felt like a weekday afternoon instead of a peak weekend. As I approached the bottom, I slowed. The base area had changed in the 20 or 30 minutes since I had been there. People were clustered around the lodge entrance, some shouting, others backing away. Several patrol snowmobiles sat parked haphazardly nearby. I could see one of our patrollers wrestling with a man in a heavy jacket, trying to keep him from lunging at a group of guests. I unclipped, skis sliding to a stop. A woman ran past me, crying, holding her forearm. I saw teeth marks in the padded sleeve of her jacket. The fabric was torn, but I would not know until later whether the bite had fully broken skin. Her eyes were wide with shock. I moved toward the lodge, but as I got closer, something inside me told me this situation was already beyond what we were trained to handle. The man our patroller was fighting did not move like a normal person. His balance was off, his movements jerky but forceful. When our guide tried to hold him in a standard restraint, it was like the man did not register pain or limits. He just kept pushing forward, mouth opening and closing in a way that made my skin crawl. Someone yelled for everyone to get inside. Resort staff were trying to pull people through the doors and close them. Another shuttle pulled up and saw the scene. Instead of stopping at the marked spot, the driver hit the brakes early, blocking part of the lot. On the far side of the base area, near the edge of the parking lot, a small group of people stumbled forward, erratic. One fell, got up, and began moving again without any sign of favoring the leg he had just twisted underneath himself. That was when the state broadcast cut through all other radio traffic. A clear, unambiguous message. This is a statewide emergency alert. A highly contagious pathogen is causing extreme violent behavior and loss of normal function. Individuals affected may not respond to pain or verbal commands. All citizens are instructed to shelter in place immediately. Avoid contact with anyone exhibiting these symptoms and do not attempt to approach them. Law enforcement and emergency services are overwhelmed. Stay off roadways. Stay inside secure structures if possible. The lodge doors slammed shut. Staff locked them. Some people were still outside, banging on the glass, shouting to be let in. Others ran for cars, ignoring the warning. In the middle of it all, the infected kept moving, drawn to the nearest source of sound and motion. I stepped back, looked up at the slopes rising above the base area, then looked at the line of cars already starting to push into the outbound road. I thought of the patrol cabin near the top, small but stocked with emergency gear, and half buried in snow from the last storm cycle. High ground, limited access, solid construction. It was the first time I seriously considered that I might not be going home anytime soon. I radioed up to Mark on the patrol channel. "Mark, base is compromised. We've got multiple infected individuals. The lodge is sealed, but there's still a lot of people outside. State's saying to shelter in place. What's your situation up there?" He answered after a second, slightly out of breath. "Quiet up here, Dan. Lifts are shut. I can see activity at the base. Looks bad. If we try to hold this from down there, we're done. We should fall back higher." I glanced at the open runs, then at the chaotic scene below. People were already being knocked down, some just trying to reach the entrance. I watched one infected person clamp down on a man's shoulder. Instead of fighting to get away, the victim seemed frozen for precious seconds. By the time others pulled them apart, the damage was done. If I stayed at the base, I would be stuck in a crowd that had no idea how to move in a dangerous environment. Infections would spread fast inside that lodge. If I went up, I had a chance to control the environment, maybe even help from a distance. "I'm coming back up," I said. "Meet me at the patrol cabin. If we can make that place secure, it'll give us a base. We can watch the whole valley from up there." "Copy," he replied. "I'll get things ready." I clipped into my skis again and pushed off. Leaving the base felt wrong. Every instinct as a patroller said I should stay where the most people were and help, but I'd been trained to prioritize survivable situations. A crowd with a contagious, violent disease and no way out was not survivable, not with the limited tools we had. The ride back up the mountain was the strangest run I had ever taken. The trails were nearly empty. A few stragglers were making their way down slowly, unaware of what was happening below. I warned the ones I passed, telling them the resort was closing and that there were dangerous individuals at the base. Some listened and cut toward alternate exits. Others shrugged it off. By the time I reached the top and skied the short distance to the patrol cabin, The wind had picked up a bit. The cabin itself sat just below a ridge, half buried in a drift from the last big storm. Only the upper half of the wall and roof were visible from the windward side. From the leeward side, where the door was, you could walk right up along a well-packed path. I stepped inside. The cabin was small, a single room with a table, radio, medical shelves, and a bunk in the corner that we used for short breaks on long shifts. A compact gasoline-powered generator sat in a covered lean-to attached to the cabin, with wiring running in through a weatherproof conduit. An old metal stovepipe poked through the roof from a corner wood stove we almost never used now that we had electric baseboard heaters in the generator. Mark was in the middle of pulling gear off hooks and laying it on the table. Emergency blankets, extra radios, avalanche beacons, a stack of trauma kits, splints, and a large duffel with rope and harnesses. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Base is a mess," I said. "We can't secure that place with what's coming. Up here, we have visibility and fewer access points. If we have to ride this out, I'd rather be here than in a crowded lodge with one set of doors." We spent the next hour taking stock. The patrol cabin was small, but it had more supplies than most people realize. Shelves held bandages, medications, oxygen bottles, IV fluids, and emergency food rations meant for patrollers caught out in storms, energy bars, freeze-dried meals, packets of electrolyte powder. There were several water containers, plus a small sink that we usually use to melt snow when needed. Outside, behind the cabin, there was a buried cache with extra blankets and a backup fuel can for the generator, marked by a fiberglass stake. We dug it out, dragging the cache box inside. We found more emergency blankets, wool layers, a couple of compact sleeping pads, and a spare propane camp stove. The generator started on the second pull. Its low, steady hum was strangely comforting. I checked the fuel level, enough to run for maybe a day and a half continuously. More if we cycled power carefully. We still had radio contact with base for a brief period. The director's voice came on, strained. "All patrol units, lodge occupants are sheltering in place. If you are able to provide assistance, do so with extreme caution. Infected individuals are now inside the building. We are losing control of the situation. State is unable to send help at this time." We listened to scattered transmissions after that. Security trying to move people to interior rooms. Staff trying to use tables as barriers. Someone shouting that one of their own had been bitten. Then, gradually, the transmissions faded, replaced by static. Whether it was because their radios went down or because the people using them did, I did not know. By nightfall, the lights at the base area were flickering. We could see them from our cabin window, dots of yellow and white along the lodge and parking lot. The movement down there was slower now, more like confusion than panic. Every so often, distant shouts carried up the valley. The reality sank in as the wind picked up and snow began to fall again. We were likely alone up here, at least for the moment. We agreed on a plan. Mark would rest first while I took the initial watch. At midnight, we would switch. It was not perfect, but neither of us had slept properly since the early morning, and exhausted patrollers make bad decisions. Around 11 p.m., the generator sputtered once, then again. I stepped outside, headlamp cutting a narrow cone through blowing snow, and checked it. The engine housing was cold, fuel gauge low. The backup can we had was already inside. I did some quick calculations. At our current draw, lights, radio, baseboard heater, we would burn through our remaining fuel before dawn. I made the call to shut it down. We switched to battery-powered lanterns inside and piled on layers. Temperatures inside the cabin dropped quickly once the heater went silent. That was when the wood stove went from decoration to lifeline. The stovepipe was still intact, but the stove itself had not seen real use in years. We cleaned it out, checked the flue, and ran our hands along the metal to feel for cracks. The last thing we needed was smoke backing into the cabin or carbon monoxide building up. We opened a small vent near the roof and another near the floor to allow fresh air circulation, then started a small fire with emergency fire starter and some old scrap wood stored out back. The difference in temperature was noticeable within half an hour, but we knew we would need more fuel if we wanted to keep this going long term. The patrol cabin was not designed to be a full-time residence in deep winter. It was meant for short-term shelter and operations. The next day, as the gray light of morning filtered through a thin layer of cloud, we reassessed. It was clear the generator was not a sustainable option unless we found more fuel. The wood stove and camp stove would have to carry most of the load. Mark and I debated staying together or splitting tasks, but a clear reality was forming. The more time passed, the more dangerous the base area would become. We needed to secure our immediate surroundings first, then think about going down. The patrol cabin was small, half buried in snow, and still stocked with medical supplies and emergency blankets. I sealed the cracked windows with plywood from a collapsed lift shack and reinforced the front door using metal rails from broken skis. Heating became a priority because temperatures dropped fast once the generator failed. I scavenged old lift maintenance buildings for kerosene, tools, and anything metal I could repurpose as ventilation ducting for a safe indoor fire setup. Living at altitude changed everything. Infected moved slower in the snow but did not stop. They wandered across the slopes in unpredictable patterns, falling into drifts and digging themselves out hours later. I spent most days maintaining snow walls around the cabin and packing down noise-free paths between key buildings. When a group of survivors tried to take shelter in the lodge below and drew a horde into the valley, the patrol cabin became my only chance of staying alive while the slopes turned dangerous for anyone caught outside. That description would become my daily reality. On the second day, Mark and I agreed that one of us needed to check the closest lift maintenance building for fuel and materials. The Lenawee lift shack was only a few hundred yards away, partially sheltered by terrain. It contained tools, spare parts, and sometimes jerry cans of fuels for emergencies. We decided I would go. Mark would stay and fortify the cabin, keeping an eye on the base area through binoculars. I strapped on my avalanche pack, not because I expected a slide — conditions were stable on the controlled terrain near the top — but because it carried essentials: shovel, probe, first aid kit, and emergency equipment. I chose snowshoes instead of skis. They were quieter and let me move more carefully over uneven snow. I strapped a compact bolt-action rifle, a .308 hunting rifle that I kept in my truck for backcountry trips, across my back. I had brought it up the previous afternoon, along with a box of ammunition, when it became clear this was not a normal emergency. I loaded the internal magazine but kept the safety firmly on. The mountain was silent as I moved toward the lift shack. No sound of chairs, no music from the base, no laughter from guests. Just the crunch of snow under my snowshoes and the soft hiss of wind over the ridge. The lift shack door was half blocked by a drift, but the upper half was accessible. I cleared enough snow to squeeze through and stepped inside. The building was bitterly cold, but intact. Tools hung on pegboards. A workbench held grease-stained rags and half-finished projects. On one shelf I found treasure: 3 5-gallon cans of kerosene and 2 of gasoline, all clearly labeled with permanent marker. I tested a small amount of kerosene by pouring it into a clear jar and checking for water separation. It looked clean. Between the kerosene and the tools, we had what we needed to run lanterns, prime the camp stove, and possibly improvise a safer way to vent heat. I hauled the cans back to the cabin one by one, taking my time and checking the terrain between each trip. From the ridge, I saw sporadic movement down by the base area. It looked like clusters of infected wandering between cars, occasionally shifting direction when someone moved or some object fell. No sign of organized rescue. No sign of anyone trying to drive out anymore. By the fourth trip, my legs were burning from the altitude and weight. I stopped near a stand of stunted trees and watched the slopes below. That was when I saw the first infected on the mountain itself. He was halfway up a blue run, moving upslope in a slow, staggering zigzag, sinking almost to his thighs with each step. His jacket was unzipped despite the cold. His head turned in short, sharp motions, as if scanning for something but not quite understanding what. Every few steps he fell forward into the snow, disappeared for a moment, then rose again. Watching him, I realized two things. First, they did not seem to feel the cold the way we did. Any normal person in that state of dress would be curled up trying to conserve heat. Second, they did not stop. The snow slowed him, but it did not deter him. When I got back to the cabin, Mark had reinforced the door with a crossbar made from 2 ski rails bolted together. He had also started to build the first of what would become our snow walls, a dense, layered barrier of packed snow and ice blocks around the windward side of the cabin. It was primitive fortification, but snow at that density might as well be concrete. "Figure if anything gets this close, it'll have to climb over this," he said. "That will make noise. Might give us enough time to react." We settled into a rough routine. Days were spent fortifying our position, scouting nearby structures and collecting anything that could help us survive the cold. Nights were spent keeping the fire going, monitoring the radio for any useful transmissions, and watching the valley. Within a week, we lost radio contact with anything beyond static and looping emergency messages. The last solid transmission I heard from an official source mentioned that several major cities had lost control of entire districts. They used careful, clinical language, but the meaning was clear. Whatever this virus was, it had spread too far and too fast for traditional containment. We switched our radio over to a mix of monitoring and broadcasting on general emergency frequencies. Every few hours, we repeated a simple message: location, elevation, number of survivors, and a note that we were stable but in need of long-term information and possible extraction if anyone was coordinating such efforts. Most of the time, there was no reply. Occasionally, we caught fragments. Someone in a mountain town below saying they were boarding up a shop. Another voice in a city saying they were trapped in an apartment building. None of them lasted long. Either they ran out of power, ran out of time, or both. On the 12th day, Mark did not wake up to his alarm. We had been taking turns with watch shifts, each trying to get at least 4 to 5 hours of sleep. The altitude, stress, and constant cold wore on us. He had been complaining of a headache and fatigue more than usual the day before, but we chalked it up to dehydration. When I shook his shoulder that morning, he did not respond. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow and irregular. I checked his pulse and felt an uneven rhythm. My training as an EMT kicked in, but I was limited by what we had. I started an IV, warmed him as best I could, checked his oxygen saturation with a small handheld monitor. It read lower than I was comfortable with. I considered whether this could be the infection, but he had not been bitten or exposed as far as we knew. Over the next few hours, his condition deteriorated. He became less responsive, then unresponsive. No matter what I did, I could not stabilize him. I could not rule out underlying conditions he had never mentioned. At altitude, with limited medical equipment, I was fighting uphill with no real way to diagnose the cause. He passed quietly in the early afternoon, still wrapped in an emergency blanket, the small cabin feeling even smaller around him. I checked for any signs of the same strange post-mortem behavior we had seen in the infected. Nothing happened at first. I waited, timing pulses, watching his pupils. When I was certain he was gone, I moved him outside into the cold just in case. I could not risk him reanimating inside the cabin with me. I do not know what took him. Maybe his heart, maybe a hidden illness, maybe something about the stress and thin air. What I do know is that from that day on, the patrol cabin was mine alone. The silence changed quality after that. It was no longer the shared quiet of two people working in sync. It was the weight of every decision falling on one person. I adjusted my routine, cut back on patrols, and focused even more on fortification and resource management. The snow walls grew higher. I reinforced the cracked windows with more plywood and foam insulation I found in a partly collapsed storage shed. I used scrap metal rails to brace the front door and added an interior latch I could slide into place quickly. I developed a network of compacted, noise-reduced paths between the patrol cabin, the lift shack, and a smaller equipment shed a bit further down. Instead of walking directly on fresh snow, which squeaked and crunched loudly, I packed down several layers until they formed firm surfaces. I added low snowbanks on either side, turning them into shallow trenches that helped to break the wind and hide my movement from casual view. Living at that altitude changed everything. I had less oxygen, especially during exertion. Every task had to be planned with that in mind. Hauling fuel, water, or firewood required frequent breaks. I learned to move slowly and deliberately rather than sprinting and risking exhaustion or mistakes. The infected, from what I observed, seemed unaffected by those limitations. They did not pant or slow noticeably from exertion beyond what the snow itself forced. They did not hunch against the wind or cover their faces. They simply moved, endlessly, until their bodies could not go any further. From the patrol cabin, I had an unobstructed view of much of the resort and the valley below. Using binoculars and occasionally the scope on my rifle, I watched as the patterns shifted over time. The first few weeks were chaotic. Infected individuals wandered the base area and parking lots, drawn toward any remaining sound or movement. At night, I could sometimes see flashlights or the flicker of flames in the lodge windows. That faded over time. Then, one early afternoon, maybe 3 weeks in, I saw something different. A thin pillar of smoke rising near the lodge, steady and deliberate. It looked like a wood or coal fire, not an accidental blaze. That meant someone down there was alive and trying to stay warm. I focused my binoculars, scanning the windows and balconies. Sure enough, I caught glimpses of people, 4 or 5 at least, moving inside the lodge. They had barricaded the main entrance with tables and furniture. At one point, I saw 2 figures on a second-floor balcony waving what looked like a bright-colored ski jacket, possibly trying to signal. I had to make a decision, reveal my position and try to contact them, or stay quiet and hope they did not draw too much attention. Eventually, I chose communication. Using the patrol radio, I switched to a frequency we had sometimes used with base staff for non-emergency coordination. I announced my location, keeping it general. Upper patrol cabin. I kept my voice calm and clear. A few moments later, someone responded. The voice was male, older, breathless, and relieved. "This is Tom," he said. "I'm the lodge cook. There are 9 of us left in here. We've been stuck since the first day. We've got some food, a gas range, and a small generator. The stairs are blocked. Most of the infected are outside, but a couple are still in the basement." We talked in short bursts over the next half hour, carefully coordinating to avoid using too much radio time, which might attract attention if anyone, or anything, down there could hear the transmissions. He told me they had sealed as many entrances as they could and were using the kitchen as a central shelter. I was honest with him about our situations. I explained that the slopes were no longer safe to travel freely. Infected had started to move up from the base area, following random paths up the runs and cat tracks. I explained how they reacted strongly to sound, and how breaking trail in deep snow could expose anyone for long periods. Tom asked if they should try to reach me. Every part of me wanted to say yes. More people meant more hands, more skills, and a better chance at long-term survival. But the conditions between us were unforgiving. Hundreds of vertical feet, open slopes, scattered infected, and unpredictable weather. If you attempt it, I said carefully, you need to choose a calm, clear day with minimal wind. Move early in the morning, when the snow is firmest and visibility is good. Stay on the edges of runs near the trees. Avoid making noise. Pack only what you can carry comfortably at this altitude. There was a long pause. We have a teenager with us, he said finally. We have a guest who used to work as a mechanic. A couple from out of state. And me. I'm not in shape for a long climb. You're safer for now where you are, I said. If I start making regular trips down there, I risk leading infected back up to the cabin. If you make a lot of noise or try to move as a large group, you'll attract more than you can handle. We settled on a compromise. They would stay put and remain as quiet as possible. I would continue to watch from above, advising them when I saw movement around the lodge that they might not be aware of. We used a simple code on the radio to reference directions relative to the lodge. Uphill, downhill, parking lot side, forest side. Multiple days passed like that. Occasionally, I would see them on their balcony, airing out blankets or dumping snow into containers to melt for water. Every time they appeared, a few infected would drift closer, but the barriers they had built seemed to hold. Then, one day, a mistake changed everything. Tom called over the radio, voice tight. We had a generator issue, he said. We were trying to fix it in a storage room near the back entrance. Someone knocked something over. It made a loud crash. Now they're all over that side of the building. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the area he described. Dozens of infected were converging on the rear entrance near the service delivery area. Some had likely been wandering the nearby parking lot before being drawn by the sudden noise. Others seemed to emerge from the trees along the edge of the resort. The survivors inside had a choice: remain barricaded and hope their defenses held, or try to escape. The infected were not coordinated, but sheer pressure could eventually move even heavy furniture if enough weight pressed against it. Tom's next message came minutes later. We can't keep this up, Dan. They're starting to crack the door frame. We have about 20 minutes before they get through. The others think we should make a run for it. Maybe cut across the back and up one of the runs toward you. I looked at the slopes they would have to climb. Open, with little cover. Snow was firm, but any misstep could send them tumbling or stuck. The infected, though slower in the snow, could still follow their tracks. You won't get all the way up here before they catch up, I said, forcing myself to be direct. You might reach mid-mountain if you move now, but you will be exposed the whole time. We don't have another option, he said. If we stay, they get in. If we go, maybe some of us make it. I tightened the strap on the rifle sling and considered my assets. From my vantage point, I had a clear line of sight to several key sections of the slope. With careful shots, I might be able to thin out any infected that got too close to them. But every shot would also be another source of noise, drawing more infected from wherever they were scattered. I'll cover you as best I can, I finally said. but you need to accept that not everyone may reach safety. If you are going to do this, go now, in a tight group, and do not stop moving until you are at least halfway up. Use the tree line on skiers' right of the run above the lodge. I can cover that area. Understood, he replied. We're moving. I watched as the lodge doors opened and 9 figures spilled into the bright afternoon light. They were bundled in layers, carrying backpacks and hastily packed bags. One of them, a thin teenager with a bright blue beanie, looked back once at the lodge before someone pushed him gently to keep moving. They started up the slope. At first, they made good progress. The snow was firm enough to hold their weight without sinking too deeply. They stuck close to the tree line, as instructed. It took less than 2 minutes for the infected to notice. From between parked cars and around corners of the lodge, figures emerged, turning toward the movement like iron filings aligning to a magnet. They began to follow, some slipping and falling. Getting up again, always advancing. Their pace was slower on the incline, but they did not hesitate. I brought the rifle up, braced my elbows on the cabin windowsill, and controlled my breathing. I had sighted in this rifle multiple times in normal circumstances. Now, every shot mattered in a way I had never experienced while hunting or target shooting. I aimed at the leading infected, exhaled halfway, and squeezed. The report of the rifle cracked across the cold air, echoing down the slope. Through the scope, I saw the infected stumble and drop. The group of survivors, hearing the shot, ducked instinctively, but then continued moving when no bullet struck near them. I fired again and again, picking targets that were closest to the group or positioned to cut them off. Each time, I watched as the infected fell or dropped out of sight behind a snowbank. But with each shot, more distant shapes began to move, drawn by the noise. Soon, the infected were emerging higher on the slope, appearing from the sides of other runs and from behind structures. I had created a new problem. While I was thinning the immediate threat, I was awakening others who might not have noticed the escape in the first place. "Tom," I called over the radio, "you've got new movement from your right, uphill. You need to veer slightly left, stay in the trees." "Copy," he said, breathing hard. "We're moving." I watched them continue, step by step, but the altitude hit them harder than they expected. They had not been acclimatized like I was. At around halfway up, their pace slowed significantly. Several bent over, hands on knees, gasping. One of the older men stumbled and went down on one knee. "Don't stop," I muttered to myself, even though they could not hear me unless Tom repeated it. I fired again, taking out an infected that was closing from behind. Another appeared from the left. I adjusted and fired, forcing myself not to rush and waste rounds. Ammunition was finite, and each shot carried a cost. Despite the support, the infected numbers increased. They were not sprinting, but their inexhaustible movement was starting to close the gap. By the time the survivors reached a stand of trees near mid-mountain, the infected were within 50 yards of their rear. "Dan," Tom gasped over the radio, "we can't keep this pace. We've lost one. He couldn't get up after falling. We had to leave him. There are too many behind us." I could see what he meant. One figure lay motionless about 100 yards downhill from the main group, already being reached by several infected. I turned my scope away. There was nothing I could do without hitting one of them in the chaos. "You need to angle toward the maintenance road," I said. "There's a cat track that heads toward the side of the mountain, where terrain is less steep. If you can reach that, you can make slower progress without falling back downhill." "Which way?" he managed. 15 degrees left of your current path toward the stand of taller trees. You should see the faint outline of a road cut horizontally into the slope. Aim for that." They pivoted, forcing their exhausted legs to change direction. The infected changed as well, following the freshest tracks. At that point, I had a choice: stay in the cabin and keep shooting, or risk heading down a bit to create a more direct diversion. The idea of leaving my fortified position went against every rule I had set for myself. But if those infected overwhelmed the survivors halfway up, not only would I lose potential allies, but the infected might continue up toward my cabin afterward, drawn by our combined noise. I slung the rifle, grabbed a small pack, and stepped outside, closing the reinforced door behind me. I set off along my pre-packed path and then veered to the edge of a ridge that overlooked the mid-mountain area. From there, I could fire from a different angle, maybe draw some of the infected sideways. I took a prone position behind a natural snowbank, rested the rifle, and fired again, this time at infected that were slightly to the side of the main group. The sound echoed off the ridges, making it harder for the infected to pinpoint the exact source, but enough of them started turning toward my position to relieve some pressure from the survivors. It worked, but at a price. Now I had infected looking uphill toward me, adjusting their sluggish climb to follow this new source of noise. I continued firing, spacing my shots, deliberately missing occasionally to produce sound in areas that would pull them away. By the time the survivors reached the cat track, 3 of the original 9 were gone. 1 had collapsed and never gotten up. Another had slipped and slid back down, only to be swarmed. A third had fallen behind, lungs unable to handle the altitude. The remaining 6 reached the cat track, where the slope lessened. They were still exhausted, but at least they were not fighting gravity as much. "Tom, you need to follow that track toward the upper maintenance yard," I said. "It curves around toward the ridge. I'll meet you halfway, but you need to keep moving." "We'll do what we can," he replied, voice faint. I retreated back toward the cabin, maintaining a staggered pattern of shots to keep infected attention divided. Once I was within 100 yards of the patrol cabin, I ducked into one of the shallow trenches I had built and followed it around to a vantage point overlooking the maintenance yard. Half an hour later, I saw them. 6 figures moving slowly along the cat track, leaning heavily on each other. The teenager's blue beanie was still visible. A woman beside him stumbled every few steps but kept recovering. I raised my rifle and scanned behind them. A cluster of infected trailed at a distance, far enough back that they posed no immediate threat but close enough to be a problem if the group faltered. "You're close," I said into the radio. "You'll see a stand of trees where the track turns sharply. Just beyond that, a path leads up toward a smaller building. I'll fire 3 shots rapidly in a row. That's where I am. Head toward that sound." I fired 3 times, spacing the shots by a second. The sound cracked across the cold air. The survivors adjusted their course. It took another 20 minutes for them to reach me. When they finally did, their faces were gray with fatigue, lips cracked from the dry air, eyes bloodshot. They looked at the cabin like it was some kind of impossible mirage. I met them halfway, helping to support a woman whose left leg was dragging slightly. She introduced herself later as Emily, a nurse from Denver who had been on a weekend trip. The teenager was her son Ryan. The mechanic was a man named Jorge from New Mexico, who had come to ski on his days off from a job in the oil fields. The remaining 2 were a couple from Kansas, Lisa and Ben, both office workers who had never expected to fight for their lives on a mountain. We ushered them into the patrol cabin, one by one, guiding them through the reinforced door and into the warmest corner near the stove. I gave them water, mixed with a bit of electrolyte powder to help with altitude sickness. Emily checked everyone's fingers and toes for frostbite, treating minor cases with careful warmth. For the first time in weeks, the cabin was loud. Voices overlapped, questions flew, and stories tumbled out in fragments. They had spent nearly 3 weeks in the lodge rationing food, dealing with minor infections, and trying to stay sane while the world outside fell apart. They had seen things inside that building they did not want to talk about in detail. Eventually, the noise settled into a fatigued quiet as exhaustion took over. Some fell asleep sitting up. Others just stared at the stove, processing. I stepped outside briefly and looked back down toward the valley. The infected that had been following them now milled around near the edge of the cat track, seemingly confused by the sudden disappearance of their targets. A few had started to wander upslope but soon slowed as the snow deepened. That night, 6 additional sleeping bodies filled the patrol cabin. It was cramped. We had to clear gear and supplies off shelves to make space, hang some items from ceiling hooks, and get creative with sleeping arrangements. But the psychological effect of not being alone was immediate. The silence felt less oppressive. Life changed again. With more people, we could do more, but we also needed more. More water, more food, more fuel. Our earlier stores had been sized for 2, then 1. Now they had to stretch for 7. We took inventory. The lodge survivors had brought what they could, several backpacks filled with canned food, rice, pasta, and some kitchen tools. They had a small camping water filter, a portable solar panel designed to charge phones and small devices, and some extra clothing. Jorge had brought a compact toolkit with several locking pliers, wrenches, and a multimeter. Gold in a place full of old electrical and mechanical systems. We established roles. Emily and I handled medical concerns. Jorge focused on mechanical and electrical systems. Tom, despite his age and fatigue, became our food manager, designing practical, calorie-dense meals from limited ingredients. The others contributed where they could, hauling snow, maintaining paths, keeping watch. We expanded the snow walls around the cabin, adding internal support using wooden beams and sections of metal railing. We carved a low, narrow passage from the cabin to the lift shack, covered by an arch of packed snow. From the outside, it looked like a slight dip in the terrain, invisible unless you knew where to step. The solar panel went on a south-facing section of roof where snow was less likely to accumulate heavily. We rigged it to charge a small bank of batteries that could power radios, headlamps, and a few essential devices. It was not much compared to the grid power we had once taken for granted, but it meant the difference between darkness and some light during long winter nights. Infected behavior remained unpredictable. Some days, they barely appeared on the slopes, perhaps drawn to something unseen further down the valley. Other days, clusters of them would slowly weave their way up runs, stopping and starting seemingly at random. Once, a small group spent nearly an hour circling a snow gun, as if the shape had confused them. We made a rule: no unnecessary loud noises, no bright lights after dusk, no leaving scent trails in multiple directions. Our small group moved like a single unit, leaving as little evidence of our presence as possible. Weeks turned into a pattern. The calendar lost meaning beyond weather cycles and resource tracking. We used simple marks on a wall near the door to count days since the lodge escape. Watching that column of lines grow brought mixed feelings. Then came the storm. It started as a low band of cloud to the west. The weather radio, still working intermittently, warned of a multi-day winter storm moving in across the continental divide. High winds, heavy snowfall, whiteout conditions. At lower elevations, it would mean travel delays and minor headaches. Up here, it meant something else entirely. We spent the day before the storm securing everything. Snow walls were inspected and reinforced. Roof vents were cleared. The woodpile behind the cabin was dug out and moved closer. The small emergency shed near the lift shack was cleared of anything we might need, in case it became inaccessible for days. By the time the first flakes started to fall, a steady wind had picked up. Temperatures dropped rapidly. We sealed the cabin as best we could without compromising ventilation. Inside, we prepared for the kind of isolation that can unnerve even experienced mountain workers. The storm hit hard that night. Wind pounded the cabin walls, snow grains blasting against wood like sand. The constant roar of air drowned out all but the loudest sounds. Visibility outside shrank to a few feet. Our world shrank to the dimensions of the patrol cabin interior. For 3 days, we lived inside a white sphere. Every few hours, someone would suit up, clip onto a safety rope anchored inside the door, and go out to check vents and shovel away accumulating drifts from around the door and lower windows. On one trip, I found that one of the roof vents was nearly blocked. Another few hours without clearing it might have caused serious air quality problems. During those days, I wondered often about the infected out in the storm. Did they freeze in place? Did they bury themselves accidentally in drifts, only to emerge later when temperatures rose? We did not see them, could not hear them over the wind. For a short while, it almost felt like the world outside was just a regular blizzard, not a landscape full of walking infections. When the storm finally passed, the silence felt unnatural after so many hours of steady wind. We opened the door and stepped out into a transformed environment. Snowdrifts were higher than ever, some reaching well up the sides of the cabin. Familiar landmarks were partially buried, their shapes softened. We climbed to the ridge and looked down toward the valley. What we saw was eerie. The slopes were dotted with lumps and shapes partially covered in snow. Some were rocks and trees. Some were vehicles at odd angles. Some, unmistakably, were human forms, frozen in unnatural positions. Every so often, one of those forms would twitch or move, sending loose snow sliding off. An arm would rise, then fall. A head would turn slowly. They were not gone, just slowed, temporarily muted by the cold and weight of the snow. The storm had not erased the infected. It had simply reshuffled the board. Time passed. Our skills improved. Our routines became more efficient. And as we settled into that new normal, a larger question loomed. Were we going to stay frozen here until we ran out of something critical, or were we going to try to change the wider situation? The answer came in the form of another hazard I knew all too well: avalanches. One afternoon, Jorge and I were out near the edge of a steep bowl that dropped into a side valley. Before the outbreak, ski patrollers had used this terrain for controlled avalanche work, firing charges from a fixed launching system and occasionally placing explosives by hand to bring down unstable snow before it could release naturally. The control routes had not been run since the outbreak began. The snowpack had grown deep and layered, with multiple crusts and slabs. My training screamed that this bowl was a loaded gun. We tested the snow with handpits and a shovel. Shear tests showed clean breaks between layers, a sign of potential slides. Under normal circumstances, we would have triggered controlled avalanches to reduce the danger for skiers. Now, there were no skiers, but there were infected. The idea came to me gradually. If we could lure a large number of infected into one of these unstable bowls and then trigger a slide from a safe distance, we might bury many of them at once, reducing the density of infected in certain zones. It would not eliminate the threat completely, but it could carve out safer corridors for travel or future escape. We had the tools, at least partially. The old avalanche control system still existed. A small steel structure near the ridge with a fixed launching barrel that had once fired explosive charges down into key trigger points. The explosives themselves were long gone, removed at the end of the last controlled season for safety. But the concept remained. We could not use factory charges, but we had access to fuel, gas lines, and an environment ready to move. I discussed the idea with the others that evening. Emily listened carefully, folding her arms. "You're talking about using the mountain itself as a weapon," she said. "I'm talking about using physics," I replied. "The slides will happen anyway eventually. We can either let them release randomly or use them to our advantage." The plan was simple in concept, but complicated in execution. We would select one or two of the most unstable bowls that also had known infected movement routes beneath them. Then we would set up bait, sound sources, and possibly visual lures to draw infected into the zone over time. Once enough had gathered, we would trigger the slide remotely and let gravity and the snow do the work. Our main challenges were threefold: creating reliable lures that would not endanger us, triggering the slides without commercial explosives, and ensuring we were not accidentally burying corridors we might need later. We solved the lure issue first. Using old outdoor speakers from the base area, a small solar-powered battery rig, and looped audio recordings, we built a sound beacon we could place at the lower edge of a bowl. We tested it at low volume first to see if it behaved as expected. It did. When turned on, it produced a periodic series of indistinct human-like sounds, murmurs, shuffles, and chairlift noises we had recorded off old promotional videos. From a vantage point, we watched its effect. Within an hour, infected in that area began drifting toward the sound source. They were not sprinting, but consistently reoriented themselves with each cycle of noise. Score 1 for predictable stimulus response behavior. Triggering the slide took more creativity. Without traditional explosives, we needed a way to apply sudden force to the weak layers. We constructed a long steel lever anchored into rock at the ridge, attached to a heavy steel plate positioned near a known weak point in the snowpack. By yanking the lever and dropping the plate onto the surface, we could create vibration and impact. In normal avalanche control, such a system would be crude, but here it might be enough to tip the balance. Jorge improved on that by rigging a remote pull system, a series of pulleys and ropes connected to a crank we could operate from a safer distance behind a thicker part of the ridge. When we turned the crank, the lever would rise and then drop the plate with force. If we timed it with warmest part of day and moderate loading, it could be effective. For days, we prepared. We chose one bowl that hung above a side valley near the resort, where infected frequently passed while wandering between the base and a small maintenance yard. The terrain was steep and concave, perfect for a significant slide if triggered correctly. On the morning we chose to execute, conditions were aligned. Temperature had risen slightly, creating some free water between layers. Light wind, good visibility. We placed the sound beacon at the lower edge of the bowl and activated it at medium volume. Then we retreated to the ridge and watched. Over several hours, infected converged. Dozens, then more. They moved in slowly, some struggling through deeper snow, others following existing tracks. From above, they looked like scattered dark shapes on a white slope, all drawn to a single point. By mid-afternoon, the number of infected in the bowl was significant. It was time. We took our positions behind the ridge, ropes in hand. Jorge looked at me. "You sure we want to do this?" he asked. "If we do nothing," I said, "they stay there or wander back to our door eventually. At least this way we change the situation on our terms." I signaled and we turned the crank. The lever rose, then fell, driving the steel plate into the snow surface with a thud we could feel through our boots. The snow did not move at first. We repeated the motion. Thud. Still nothing. On the third strike, I saw it. A subtle, wide crack propagating across the bowl just beneath the surface. A low, deep rumble started, felt more than heard. Then, the entire center of the bowl detached and began to move downhill as a unified mass. The infected inside reacted too slowly. Some turned, others held their ground, still drawn to the sound beacon. The slab picked up speed, breaking into chunks, snow billowing upward. We watched as the mass swept them off their feet, tumbling them, burying them. In a matter of seconds, the slope below was filled with moving snow, then settling snow, then stillness. When the powder cloud settled, the bowl looked entirely different. The snow surface was smooth, with debris from trees and rocks scattered throughout. No sign of movement remained at first. Over the next hour, we saw occasional twitching near the edges. An arm breaking through here, a head moving slightly there. But the majority had been buried deep and immobilized. Some might eventually re-emerge in thaw conditions, but for the foreseeable future, that section was cleared. We used similar techniques cautiously on a few other select terrain features over the following weeks. Each time, we made sure not to compromise our own travel routes. The strategy was not about winning anything. It was about carving out safer zones and reducing constant pressure. Throughout all this, the patrol cabin remained our anchor. We improved it with each passing week. Jorge built a makeshift heat exchanger from scrap metal and ducting to capture more warmth from the stove and distribute it more evenly. We added a secondary ventilation intake at a carefully measured height to reduce condensation and improve air quality. I taught Ryan how to use avalanche beacons, probes, and shovels properly, even though the likelihood of a traditional slide rescue was low. Skills were habits, and I wanted him to think methodically, not reactively. Emily ran regular health checks, monitoring for early signs of frostbite, respiratory issues, or malnutrition. Tom refined our food system, convincing us that variety in meals, even small ones, helped morale as much as calories. Sometimes we talked about leaving, about waiting for late spring when the snow would soften and lower elevations might be more accessible, about trying to reach the interstate or a small town further down the valley. But every time we ran the scenario, the risks stacked up high. Unknown infected density at lower levels, lack of functioning vehicles, potential broken bridges, lack of communication. Up here, at least, we understood the terrain. We controlled our immediate environment. We had vantage points. Our biggest threats were resource depletion and changes we could not anticipate, like structural failure of the cabin or a massive slide in the wrong place. One night, as we sat around the stove, listening to the faint hiss of wind outside, Ryan asked a question that had been on everyone's mind but rarely voiced. "Do you think anyone out there is organizing something?" he said. "Like a camp or a safe zone?" I looked at the radio set on the shelf. We still scanned frequencies regularly, but clear, organized transmissions had become rare. We heard occasional survivors. We heard loops of old emergency messages. We heard static. "I think," I said slowly, "that if anyone is organizing something, they're doing it quietly, with whatever they have, just like us. Maybe in a small town, or secure facility, or a ship. Somewhere they can control entrances and exits." "Do you think they'll ever come up here?" he continued. "Maybe," I said. "If they know we're here and if they have the resources to reach us. In the meantime, we act as if we are on our own. That way, any help that comes is a bonus, not something we depend on." He nodded, accepting that answer for now. As winter stretched on, the patrol cabin stopped feeling like a temporary shelter and started feeling like home. The worn wooden surfaces, the smell of smoke and wool, the view from the small window. It all became familiar in a way that, months earlier, I would never have believed possible. I knew every creak of the floor, every draft from the doorframe. I knew how long it took for a kettle of snow to melt into drinkable water on the stove. I knew the precise angle to hold the radio antenna to get the best reception during different times of day. We were not thriving. That would be dishonest to say. We were surviving. But we were doing it methodically, with intention, relying on skills, training, and each other. The world below might have been unrecognizable now. Cities changed, highways clogged, governments strained or broken. Up here, on the side of a cold mountain above a valley of frozen infected, our reality was compressed into a few hundred yards of snow and wood and metal. I often stood outside on clear nights, looking at the stars. At this altitude, with no light pollution, the sky was sharp and full. I did not make wishes or attach meaning to constellations. I just used them to orient myself, the same way I always had on overnight rescue missions before everything changed. That was the thing. For all the horror and chaos of the outbreak, some fundamentals remained. Snow still fell according to the weather. Wood still burned. Water still boiled at lower temperatures up here than at sea level. The human body still needed calories, warmth, and rest. The infected did not rewrite the laws of physics. They just added a new layer of danger on top of a world that was already dangerous in its own ways. In the end, that is how I stay sane. Not by pretending things will magically return to how they were, but by focusing on what I can measure and manage. The patrol cabin was small, yes, half buried in snow, but inside those walls we built something stable in a very unstable world. We turned a deserted ski patrol cabin into a survival base, not by luck, but by incremental decisions and respect for the environment we lived in. If someone ever hears this story, maybe they will be in another small outpost somewhere, stacked against their own problems. Maybe they will know what it feels like to count days by hatch marks on a wall and listen to empty radio channels at night. If that is you, then know this. You do not need a fortress to survive. You need a place you understand, tools that work, people you can rely on, and the will to adjust your plans as reality shifts. For us, that place was a patrol cabin above a Colorado ski area, looking down on a valley that froze along with everything in it. And as long as the stove burns, the vents stay clear, and the snow walls hold, this little box in the snow will remain our base, our observation post, and our line between order and the cold, relentless, slow movement of the infected below. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.